At 9:34 p.m. on July 13, 1977, a bolt of lightning hit transmission lines north of New York City, and within 90 minutes, 8 million people would be plunged into total darkness, and some would never see their neighborhoods the same way again. The strike itself lasted less than a second, a brilliant white crack against the purple summer sky. But in the Con Edison control room in Manhattan, that single flash triggered a cascade of red warning lights that would illuminate faces frozen in disbelief. John Morrison had been monitoring the grid for 11 years, and he'd seen storms before. The summer of '77 had been brutal, temperatures hovering in the mid-90s for weeks, air conditioning units straining the system to its limits. The city was already running hot in every sense. The Son of Sam had everyone looking over their shoulders. 3 more people shot just days ago in Brooklyn. The newspapers screamed about municipal bankruptcy, about President Ford telling the city to drop dead, about a metropolis teetering on the edge of collapse. But Morrison wasn't thinking about any of that when the first alarm sounded. He was thinking about the Buchanan South substation, about circuit breakers that should have held, and about the sick feeling spreading through his chest as he watched the numbers on his console spike and fall. The lightning strike hit at exactly 9 hours, 34 minutes, and 3 seconds p.m. The bolt found 2 345 kilovolt transmission lines near Buchanan, New York, and, for reasons that would be debated in technical reports for years to come, the backup systems failed. Not slowly, not with warning. They failed like dominoes, each protective relay somehow blind to the crisis unfolding. Morrison grabbed the phone to call the Buchanan station, but before the line connected, another alarm screamed. Then, another. Within 8 minutes, the entire power supply for New York City was being carried by 2 transmission lines, 2 fragile threads holding up the electrical demands of 8 million people. His supervisor, Margaret Chen, appeared at his shoulder. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the cascading failures painting the control board in urgent red. Morrison had trained under Chen for 5 years before getting his own station, and he'd never seen that particular expression on her face, the one that meant the situation had moved beyond protocols and procedure into something else entirely. She reached past him and flipped 3 switches in rapid succession, trying to reroute power through alternate pathways. The board flickered. For exactly 12 seconds, it looked like it might work. Then the Ravenswood generating plant went offline, then Long Island. The last 2 transmission lines, already straining under impossible loads, overheated and automatically disconnected. At 9:36 p.m., the city went dark in waves, spreading from north to south like someone pulling a blanket over the boroughs. Morrison would later tell investigators that the moment reminded him of watching a heartbeat flatline on a hospital monitor. That same terrible finality, that same awful silence where noise should be. But in that first instant, before anyone understood the scope, there was only confusion. Traffic lights blinked out mid-cycle, leaving cars frozen in intersections. Subway trains coasted to stops in tunnels, their emergency lighting casting everything in sickly yellow. In apartments across the city, televisions died mid-sentence, refrigerators stopped humming, and the ever-present background noise of urban electricity, that sounds so constant it becomes silence, simply ceased. For the first few seconds, people waited for the lights to flicker back on. This was New York. Things broke and got fixed. Power went out and came back. Except this time, it didn't come back. On the Upper West Side, a woman named Patricia Hernandez was 7 months pregnant and climbing the stairs to her 6th-floor apartment when the lights died. She froze, one hand on the railing, the other on her belly where her daughter was kicking. The stairwell had no windows. The darkness was so complete, She literally couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She heard doors opening above and below, voices calling out, someone asking if this was just their building or if anyone else could see the skyline. But there was no skyline. Through the window at the landing above, where she could usually see the illuminated grid of Manhattan stretching south, there was nothing. Just black. Patricia would make it to her apartment. Neighbors formed a human chain, passing her up the stairs by touch and voice. She would spend the next 25 hours in a sweltering room with her husband and 2 young sons, listening to a battery-powered radio that told her almost nothing useful. But in that first moment in the stairwell, in that profound and unexpected darkness, what she felt more than fear was confusion. New York didn't just stop. New York didn't go silent. This was a city that never slept. And suddenly it was unconscious. Back in the Con Edison control room, Morrison and Chen were already on emergency protocols. Backup generators kicked in, bathing the room in auxiliary power. Banks of phones started ringing, field stations reporting in, substations trying to coordinate, and increasingly police precincts asking how long until the lights came back. Chen fielded the calls with mechanical precision. 20 minutes, she told them. Maybe an hour. They were working on it. Standard blackout procedure. Stay calm. We've done this before. But Morrison was studying the damage reports, and he knew this wasn't standard. The cascade had been too complete, too systemic. Bringing the grid back online wasn't going to be a matter of flipping switches. They'd need to coordinate with generating plants across the tri-state area, systematically rebuild the network, balance loads carefully to avoid another cascade. His best estimate, the one he whispered to Chen between phone calls, was 6 to 8 hours. Minimum, maybe longer if they hit complications. Chen's face went very still. She glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. 8 hours meant dawn at the earliest. An entire night of darkness in a city that was already fracturing under economic pressure, racial tension, and a summer heat wave that had everyone's nerves stripped bare. She picked up the phone to call the mayor's office, and Morrison heard her voice shift into something harder, more formal. They had a situation. Yes, the whole city. No, not anytime soon. In Brooklyn, on a dark stretch of Broadway near Myrtle Avenue, a group of teenagers stood outside a closed electronics store, their faces lit intermittently by passing headlights. The store had been there for 30 years, family-owned, metal gate usually pulled down and locked by 8 p.m. But tonight, the owner had been caught off guard by the blackout. He'd locked the front door and left, trusting the gate and the locks and the basic social contract that said stores don't get robbed just because the lights are out. That contract had held in 1965 during the last major blackout. People had shared candles, directed traffic, checked on elderly neighbors. Some called it the night New York showed its heart. One of the teenagers, a 17-year-old named Marcus, who'd been laid off from a grocery store the week before when the owner couldn't make payroll, picked up a loose brick from a pile of construction debris. He held it for a long moment, feeling its weight, looking at his own reflection barely visible in the dark storefront glass. Later, he would tell a public defender that he didn't plan it, didn't really think about it, just felt the anger that had been building for months. No job, no money, watching his mother work 2 shifts just to keep their apartment, just crystallize into motion. He threw the brick. The glass exploded inward with a sound like ice cracking, and for maybe 10 seconds nobody moved. Then someone reached through the broken window. Then someone else. Within 5 minutes the gate was up, ripped from its moorings by sheer force and numbers. Within 10 minutes, the store was empty, its inventory carried off in armfuls and shopping carts and car trunks. A man drove his Cadillac onto the sidewalk, popped the trunk, and loaded in 3 television sets while his wife stood watch. A mother with 2 children took a record player and a box of 45s. Teenagers grabbed anything with a cord. Radios, toasters, blenders, things they didn't need but could sell, trade, or just have. Because for this one night, the normal rules seemed suspended. The sound of breaking glass echoed down the block. Other stores, other windows, a furniture shop, a clothing boutique, a grocery. Not random violence, not yet, but a kind of spontaneous collective breaking of a seal. Later, sociologists would write papers about it, about the tipping point where individual restraint gives way to group action, about how quickly order can dissolve when the structures enforcing it become invisible. But in the moment, it was simpler than that. It was opportunity meeting resentment, meeting darkness. The police got the first calls at 10:02 p.m. Breaking and entering, Broadway and Myrtle. Then another call, and another. Within 20 minutes, the reports were coming in faster than the dispatcher could log them. Bushwick, Harlem, Crown Heights, the Bronx. Not isolated incidents. Not a few bad actors. Waves of people, whole blocks emptying into the streets, stores being stripped down to the walls. The overnight commander at the 79th Precinct in Bedford-Stuyvesant stared at the call log and felt something close to vertigo. They had maybe 15 officers on duty for a neighborhood of over 100,000 people. In the dark, with no traffic lights, no street lights, no backup on the way because every precinct was being hit simultaneously. He grabbed his radio and tried to call for support from neighboring precincts, but the system was overloaded. Everyone was calling. Everyone needed help. He sent his officers out anyway, into a darkness that was already slipping beyond control, and told them to do what they could. "Document what you see," he said. "Stay safe. Don't take unnecessary risks." The subtext was clear. There's nothing we can do to stop this. We're just trying to keep people from getting killed. At Coney Island Hospital, the emergency generator kicked in 90 seconds after the blackout. 90 seconds of absolute darkness in a building full of sick people, many of them on machines that couldn't stop for 90 seconds. A nurse named Lillian Foster was in the ICU when the lights died, and in that minute and a half before the backup power caught, she moved on pure training and memory. She found the patient in bed 3, a man recovering from a stroke, on a ventilator, and checked his tube by feel, making sure it hadn't dislodged, monitoring his breathing by the sound alone. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady, telling him it was okay, just a power issue, we've got you. When the lights came back harsh and yellow on the generator, she saw that his monitor had flatlined during the gap. No heartbeat registered for 90 seconds because there was no power to register it. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. The machines had failed, but the body kept going. She took that as a sign. Whatever was happening out there in the dark city, in here, they'd keep going too. If these forgotten moments of urban history intrigue you, the nights when everything changed, a quick like helps us keep uncovering the stories hiding in the darkness. Back in the Con Edison control room, Morrison was coordinating with power plants, trying to map a path back to electricity, but each call brought new complications. The Ravenswood plant couldn't restart without external power to jumpstart its systems. Indian Point Nuclear Facility had scrammed, automatically shut down, as a safety measure, and bringing a nuclear plant back online was a process measured in hours, not minutes, with federal oversight and safety checks at every stage. The grid had failed so completely that there was no easy way to rebuild it. They'd have to do it piece by piece, section by section, balancing load and supply with precision, because one mistake could trigger another cascade. Chen hung up from a call with the mayor's office and turned to Morrison with an expression that told him the news was being shared up the chain. The governor was being briefed. The president would probably know within the hour. This wasn't just a New York problem anymore. This was national news. She sat down at her console and started drafting the technical report they'd need, documenting every failure, every decision, building the record that investigators would pick apart for years. Morrison watched her type and wondered if anyone outside this room understood what they were looking at. Not a blackout. A collapse. And in the wreckage, something was stirring. On the streets of Bushwick, Marcus stood in front of the gutted electronics store, a portable radio in his hands that he'd grabbed on the second wave of looting, after the initial shock had worn off and it became clear that no police were coming. The radio was nice, expensive, still in its box. He could sell it for $50, maybe $60. But he wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the sound of the glass breaking, about how easy it had been, about how no one stopped them, about how the store owner had taken 30 years to build this business, and it had taken them 20 minutes to erase it. A police car rolled past slowly, spotlight sweeping across the crowd that had gathered. People scattered, carrying their stolen goods into alleys and buildings. Marcus ran too, radio clutched to his chest, but not far. Just around the corner. Because the cop car didn't stop. Didn't chase. Just kept rolling, documenting the damage, the officers inside, looking like they were in shock. Marcus caught his breath in a doorway and realized something that made his skin prickle. They can't stop us. Not tonight. There are too many of us and not enough of them. And in the dark, the rules are different. It began not with a plan, but with a single broken window on Broadway and Myrtle. But what started as one window was spreading, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, until the sound of breaking glass became the soundtrack of the blackout. And what nobody knew yet, what they wouldn't understand until the sun came up and revealed the full scope, was that this was just the beginning. The word spread through the darkness like electricity once had, through shouts across fire escapes, through car windows rolling down at intersections, through the strange inverted logic of a city where suddenly everyone could hear everything because nothing else was making noise. By 10:15 p.m., less than 40 minutes after the lights died, neighborhoods across Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Harlem knew what Bushwick already understood. The police weren't coming. The rules had changed. And the night was young. In Crown Heights, a bodega owner named Samuel Rodriguez heard the glass break 3 stores down and knew immediately what it meant. He'd been locking up when the blackout hit, had made it halfway home before turning around and coming back. His store was his life. 22 years building a customer base, extension of credit to neighbors who were short until payday, the kind of trust that couldn't be rebuilt if it broke. He stood now in his doorway with a baseball bat, watching shadows move down the street, watching the crowd swell like a wave approaching shore. The first group to reach his store was 4 teenagers, maybe 15 or 16 years old. They stopped when they saw him standing there, saw the bat. For a long moment, nobody moved. Rodriguez recognized one of them. Carlos, a kid who came in after school for candy, whose mother bought groceries there every Wednesday. Their eyes met in the dim glow of passing headlights. Rodriguez tightened his grip on the bat. Carlos looked away first, touched his friend's shoulder, and they moved on to the next store, the one that was already dark and empty and undefended. Rodriguez would stand there for 6 hours, until his legs shook and his hands cramped around the bat. He would watch 17 stores on his block get looted, and 2 get burned. He would turn away neighbors he'd known for years, people who pleaded and people who threatened. And he would save his store. But the cost would be knowing exactly who tried to take it from him, and having to see those same faces in line the next week, the next month, the next year. Some betrayals you can't unlearn. 3 blocks away, a different scene was unfolding. Angela Martinez had 3 children under the age of 8, and a refrigerator that had stopped running an hour ago. The milk would go bad by morning. The meat would spoil by afternoon. She'd budgeted carefully to make it through the week, and now she was looking at losing maybe $40 worth of food they couldn't afford to lose. When she heard the commotion outside, breaking glass, shouting, the sound of many feet running, she looked out her window and saw people carrying armfuls of groceries from the Food King supermarket on the corner. She told herself she was just going to look, just going to see what was happening. But when she got downstairs and saw the door hanging open, the registers emptied and abandoned, the aisles full of people just taking whatever they needed, something shifted in her thinking. This wasn't stealing. This was survival. The store had insurance. The owners lived in the suburbs. Her kids needed to eat. She filled 2 bags with diapers, formula, bread, canned goods, and walked home, without running, without hiding, just another person doing what she had to do in a city that had stopped protecting her a long time ago. Later, she would have trouble reconciling this moment with who she thought she was. She'd never stolen anything in her life. She went to church. She raised her children to respect other people's property. But she'd also been barely keeping her head above water for months, watching prices rise and wages stagnate. And in that moment when the normal rules disappeared, what came up wasn't criminality. It was pragmatism. The food was there, her kids were hungry, the lights were out. Simple math. By 10:30 p.m., the NYPD was fully aware they were facing something unprecedented. The overnight shift command center in Manhattan looked like a war room. Phones ringing constantly, radio chatter overlapping into chaos, incident reports streaming in faster than they could be processed. Captain Robert DeLuca had been with the department for 23 years, had worked the 1965 Blackout, had seen riots and protests and every kind of urban crisis. But even he was struggling to process the scope of what he was seeing on the city map, where red pins marked reported looting incidents. There were already over 200 pins, and they were still getting calls. The problem was mathematical and brutal. The city had roughly 22,000 police officers total, maybe 5,000 on duty at any given time, spread across 5 boroughs and 305 square miles. Even if he could coordinate a perfect response, which was impossible with communications degraded and traffic lights dark and chaos spreading faster than information, he simply didn't have enough bodies to be everywhere at once. The looters had numbers. The police had authority that only worked when people chose to respect it. And tonight, in the darkness, that respect had evaporated. DeLuca made a decision that would haunt him in review boards and newspaper editorials for years. He ordered his officers to prioritize life-threatening situations, fires with people trapped, medical emergencies, active violence, property crime, even wholesale looting was now secondary. Document it, report it, but don't risk officer safety for merchandise. The subtext was darker. Let them take the televisions and stereos. Just try to keep them from killing each other. Or you. Officers in the field received these orders, with a mix of relief and revulsion. In Bushwick, Sergeant James Mitchell stood in his patrol car, watching a department store get systematically emptied, watching people pass stolen goods through broken windows in a human chain that stretched half a block. His partner, a rookie named Tommy Chen, asked quietly if they should intervene. Mitchell looked at the crowd, maybe 200 people, more arriving every minute, and then at the 2 of them in their car. He shook his head and picked up his radio to call it in. department store at 1542 Broadway. Multiple looters. Requesting backup. The dispatcher came back with a response he already knew was coming. No backup available. All units engaged. Document and stand by. Chen asked what they were supposed to do. Mitchell put the car in gear and drove slowly past the scene, spotlight painting faces that turned away or stared back with defiance or ignored them completely, too focused on getting their share before it was all gone. What they were supposed to do, Mitchell said, was survive the night. Tomorrow they could count the damage. Tonight, they were just trying to keep the city from burning down completely. But the fires had already started. In the South Bronx, a furniture store on Prospect Avenue was burning. Orange flames visible for blocks, casting dancing shadows on the faces of people who'd stopped looting nearby stores to watch. The fire department arrived 8 minutes after the first call. Decent response time, considering, but by then the building was fully involved. The firefighters unrolled hoses and found the hydrant pressure was low, something to do with the blackout affecting the water pumps. They did what they could with what they had, which wasn't enough. The furniture store burned to the ground, and while they were there, 3 more fires got called in, then 5 more. Then they stopped counting. Fire Chief Ronald Harris had been monitoring the calls from the central dispatch, watching in real time as his city started burning in multiple locations simultaneously. On a normal night, they might handle 50 fire calls citywide. In the first 3 hours of the blackout, they'd logged over 200, and the pattern was clear. These weren't accidental fires from candles tipping over or electrical shorts. These were deliberate. Arson. Buildings torched after being looted, either to cover evidence or from pure destructive impulse, or for reasons Harris couldn't begin to understand. He'd been a firefighter for 28 years, had seen the city at its worst, and he'd never seen anything like this. His crews were exhausted already, running from call to call with barely time to refill their tanks. The heat was brutal. Mid-90s, even after dark, and the fires made it worse. Firefighters worked in full gear, sweating through their uniforms, breathing smoke, saving what they could, and watching the rest burn. Harris made the same calculation DeLuca had made. Prioritize occupied buildings. Let the empty ones burn. Try to contain the spread. And pray for the power to come back, before the whole city turned to ash. In Harlem, a different kind of response was emerging. Community leaders who'd been through the civil rights struggles of the 60s, who'd seen neighborhoods burn in previous riots, were trying to organize protection efforts. Reverend Thomas Washington stood on the steps of his church on 125th Street with a megaphone, calling on young people to go home, to not destroy their own community, to remember that whatever they took tonight would be gone tomorrow, but the damage would last for years. Some people listened. Some people kept walking toward the sound of breaking glass. Washington's church was a community anchor, had been feeding people through the recession, helping with rent assistance, providing after-school programs. He had credibility, he had trust, but he also understood what the looters understood, that this wasn't really about televisions and stereos. This was about rage that had been building for years, about unemployment that hit 40% in some neighborhoods, about a city that seemed to be abandoning entire communities. The blackout didn't create those problems, it just turned off the lights that had been hiding them. A young man stopped on the church steps, maybe 19 or 20, carrying a portable radio. Washington recognized him from the neighborhood, called him by name, asked him to think about what he was doing. The young man looked at the radio, looked at the reverend, and said something Washington would remember for the rest of his life. "Reverend, I think about it every day. Every day I think about not having a job, not having money, watching my mother work herself to death for nothing. Tonight I don't want to think. I just want to take something back." Then he walked away, and Washington watched him go, understanding completely and helplessly at the same time. By midnight, 4 hours into the blackout, certain patterns had become clear. The looting was concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods: Bushwick, Brownsville, the South Bronx, parts of Harlem. The affluent areas, the Upper East Side, much of Manhattan below 96th Street, were experiencing the blackout as an inconvenience, not a breakdown of social order. People in those neighborhoods were having impromptu street parties, sharing wine and candles, treating it as an adventure. The contrast was so stark it could have been two different cities, and in a sense it was. Television stations, running on emergency generators, were broadcasting scattered reports, but most couldn't show the full scope because their camera crews couldn't get to the worst areas safely. Radio stations became the primary information source, and what they were reporting sounded apocalyptic. Hundreds of stores looted, dozens of fires burning, thousands of people in the streets. The subtext in every broadcast was the same question: where are the police? The police were drowning. By midnight, they'd made maybe 300 arrests. But for every person they arrested, 100 got away. The city jails were already at capacity, and processing this many people was overwhelming a system designed for normal crime levels. Officers were improvising holding areas, parking lots, gymnasiums, anywhere they could temporarily detain people, but they couldn't arrest their way out of this. The numbers didn't work. For every store they protected, 10 went unguarded. For every arrest they made, the crowd grew larger somewhere else. And then there were the fires. By 1 a.m., over 400 fires were burning across the city. The fire department had shifted to triage mode: save what you can, contain what you can't save, and try to keep the flames from spreading to occupied buildings. Entire blocks in the South Bronx looked like war zones, smoke rising in columns visible for miles. The glow from the fires created an eerie orange twilight that replaced the electric light New York had lost. Officer Maria Santos found herself standing guard outside a hospital in the Bronx, where the emergency room was overflowing with victims. People injured looting, people burned in the fires, people suffering heat exhaustion or heart attacks or panic. The doctors and nurses were working by emergency lighting, triaging patients in the parking lot because there was no room inside. Santos was supposed to be preventing looters from targeting the hospital pharmacy, but mostly she was watching the neighborhood burn and feeling helpless. A woman approached her, elderly, maybe 70, walking with a cane. She asked Santos if this was the end times, if the city was falling apart for good. Santos wanted to reassure her, to say everything would be fine. But she'd been on duty since the blackout started, and she'd seen things that made her question whether New York could come back from this. Instead, she told the truth. She said she didn't know. She said tomorrow they'd start figuring it out. Tonight they were just surviving. The woman nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. Then she asked Santos if she'd had anything to eat. Santos admitted she hadn't. No time, no place open. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Said she'd made it that afternoon before the power went out. Said a young person like Santos needed to keep her strength up. Santos tried to refuse, but the woman insisted, pressing the sandwich into her hands before shuffling away into the darkness. Santos stood there holding the sandwich, watching the fires burn, listening to sirens wail and glass break and people shout, and felt something crack in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Kindness in the middle of chaos. Generosity from someone who had almost nothing. It was such a small thing, and it hit her harder than anything else that night. Because it meant that even now, even in the worst of it, there were still people who chose to be human. But what the history books don't tell you is that while some people were sharing sandwiches, others were systematically destroying their own neighborhoods with a precision that suggested this wasn't random chaos. It was organized rage, stores that had been price gouging, landlords who'd been ignoring repairs, businesses that had discriminated or disrespected. These were often the first targets. The looters knew which stores to hit. They had lists, grievances, scores to settle. This wasn't mindless violence. It was violence with memory. Marcus, the teenager who'd thrown the first brick, was back home by 1:30 a.m. with his portable radio and a growing sense of unreality. He sat on his fire escape listening to the radio, looking out at a neighborhood that was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. He'd been part of something tonight. Something big. Something that felt like power in a life that usually felt powerless. But he'd also seen things that scared him. The pure rage on some faces, the casual violence, the way normal people turned into something else when the lights went out and nobody was watching. His mother came out on the fire escape, saw the radio, knew immediately where it came from. She didn't yell, didn't lecture. Just asked him one question. Was it worth it? Marcus looked at the radio, at the neighborhood burning in the distance, at his mother's tired face. He didn't have an answer. He was 17 years old, and the city he'd known had just revealed itself to be something different. Something fragile and dangerous and divided. The radio felt heavy in his hands suddenly. Like evidence. Like proof of something he couldn't take back. Below them on the street, people were still moving through the darkness, still carrying things, still breaking into stores that hadn't been hit yet. The night was only half over. The sun wouldn't rise for another 6 hours. And in that darkness, New York was discovering exactly what it was made of. Not the myth of the city that never sleeps, not the romantic vision of resilience and community, but something raw and more honest. A city of 8 million people who were mostly just trying to survive, and who sometimes did terrible things in the trying. The first hour of chaos had become the second, then the third, and nobody knew when it would end. The first deliberate fire was set at 11:47 p.m. in a furniture store on Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. Witnesses would later tell investigators that a group of young men had finished looting the store, carrying out sofas and lamps and bedroom sets, and then one of them had gone back inside with a can of lighter fluid. The flames were visible within minutes, climbing the walls and spreading to the apartments above before the fire department could respond. By the time Engine Company 46 arrived, the building was already lost. What they could do, what they did, was focus on keeping the fire from jumping to neighboring structures, creating a perimeter of water and hope while the furniture store collapsed in on itself in showers of sparks and timber. Firefighter Michael O'Brien had been on shift since 6 that evening, had already responded to 8 fire calls before midnight. The furniture store was his 9th. He stood in the street with the hose aiming water at a building that was past saving, and watched faces in the crowd illuminated by the orange glow. Some looked horrified, some looked satisfied. Some just watched with blank expressions, like this was a movie they were seeing for the 2nd or 3rd time. O'Brien had grown up in the Bronx, had lived here his whole life, and he didn't recognize this version of his home. The geography was the same, but something fundamental had shifted. His captain, Vincent DeSantis, shouted over the roar of the flames that they had another call. An appliance store on Fordham Road, also deliberately set. They'd have to abandon this fire, let it burn itself out, and move to the new location. O'Brien wanted to argue. There were people still in the apartments above. He could hear them screaming. But DeSantis was already on the radio coordinating with the police to evacuate the upper floors. They had to make choices. Brutal choices. Save what you can, accept what you can't, move to the next crisis. By 2 a.m., the fire department had recorded over 600 fire calls, a number that seemed impossible, except it was happening in real time. The central dispatch had stopped trying to send specific units to specific fires. Instead, they were directing crews to geographic zones, telling them to handle whatever was burning in their sector. The system that normally ran on precision and coordination had devolved into chaos management. Put out what you can, contain what you can't, try not to get killed in the process. What the fire department reports wouldn't reveal until years later was the pattern beneath the chaos. At least 40 of those fires were set by building owners themselves, trying to escape from properties they could no longer afford to maintain. The South Bronx had been hemorrhaging population for years, losing residents to the suburbs, losing businesses to economic decline. Property values had collapsed. Insurance was often worth more than the buildings. And on a night when the police were overwhelmed and the fire department couldn't respond to everything, when chaos provided perfect cover, some owners saw an opportunity they'd never have again. Benjamin Katz owned 3 apartment buildings in the Bronx, all of them half empty, all of them losing money every month. His grandfather had built those buildings in the 1920s, had taken pride in providing housing for working families. But that was a different city, a different economy. Now the buildings were anchors dragging Katz toward bankruptcy. He'd tried to sell them, nobody wanted them. He'd tried to renovate them, couldn't afford it. And now, standing in the dark outside the middle building, the one that was in the worst shape, he held a jerry can full of gasoline and made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The insurance would cover it. The tenants were mostly gone already, had been leaving steadily for months. The few remaining families he'd quietly paid to relocate earlier that week, telling them the building had structural issues. Which wasn't even a lie. It did have issues. Issues that would cost more to fix than the building was worth. Issues that would disappear if the building wasn't there anymore. He poured the gasoline in the basement, lit a match, and walked away before the flames took hold. By the time the fire department arrived, it was an inferno. And Katz was 3 blocks away, watching from a distance, telling himself this was survival, not crime. He wasn't wrong about the economics. What he was wrong about was thinking he could live with it. Years later, he'd tell a journalist that he still saw that fire every time he closed his eyes. Still heard the building collapse. Still felt the heat on his face. The insurance money had saved him from bankruptcy, but it hadn't saved him from knowing what he'd done. Some prices are too high, even when you pay them. In Bushwick, entire blocks were burning. The fires had started with individual stores and spread to apartment buildings, jumping from roof to roof, feeding on decades of deferred maintenance and cheap materials. Engine Company 277 was trying to save a 5-story residential building where families were trapped on the upper floors. Lieutenant James Morrison coordinated the ladder crew while his team broke down the front door and started evacuating people through the smoke. The heat was tremendous. Over 100 degrees inside the building, flames climbing the walls, the air thick enough to choke on. They got 12 people out. A family of 5 from the 3rd floor, an elderly couple from the 4th, a single mother with 3 kids from the 2nd. They got them out and handed them to paramedics who were treating smoke inhalation and burns in the street because the hospitals were too overwhelmed to take anyone who wasn't critical. And then, as Morrison was about to send his crew back in to check the 5th floor, the stairwell collapsed. Just gave way. Decades of questionable construction finally failing under the stress of fire and water and desperate people running for their lives. There was still someone on the 5th floor. Morrison could hear them screaming, a woman's voice, calling for help, getting weaker as the smoke thickened. He radioed for a ladder to the 5th floor windows, but the ladder truck was at another fire 3 blocks away. He looked at his crew. Young firefighters, some on their first major incident. All of them exhausted and scared. He could order them in. That was his job. But the building was coming apart, and he'd already made peace with the math that this night demanded. You save who you can, you accept the rest. He didn't order them in. The woman's screaming stopped. The building burned. Morrison would carry that decision for the next 40 years, would wake up sometimes hearing that voice, would wonder if there was a different choice he could have made. His therapist would tell him he'd done the right thing, that sending his crew into that building would have meant more deaths, not fewer. His priest would tell him God understood. His wife would tell him he was a hero. But Morrison knew the truth. Sometimes there is no right choice. Sometimes you just have to live with the wrong ones. By 3 a.m., the fires had created their own weather system. The heat rising from hundreds of burning buildings was generating updrafts, pulling in air from surrounding areas, creating winds that spread embers and started new fires blocks away from the original blazes. Meteorologists would later study the phenomenon, would write papers about urban fire dynamics and heat islands. But in the moment, firefighters just called it hell. A burning city generating the wind that made it burn faster. The smoke was visible from space. Satellite imagery captured the next day would show a dark plume covering most of the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn. But on the ground, at street level, the smoke was a physical presence, thick and oily, coating everything it touched. People who lived through that night would talk about the smell for years, burning wood and plastic and rubber, chemicals nobody could identify, the acrid tang of destruction. Laundry hung outside to dry would still smell like smoke a week later. Paint on cars would be permanently discolored. The smoke got into everything, became part of the city's texture. Fire Chief Ronald Harris stood in the parking lot of Engine Company 82 looking at a map of the city studded with red pins marking active fires. Over 1,000 fires now. More than 1,000. The number was so large it seemed abstract, meaningless. But each pin represented people in danger, property being destroyed, firefighters risking their lives. Harris had been coordinating responses for 7 hours straight, making impossible decisions about where to send limited resources. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders into the radio. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. A reporter from the New York Times had somehow gotten into the command center, was asking Harris for a statement about the fire department's response. Harris looked at him with an expression that made the reporter step back. What did he want Harris to say? That they were doing their best? That the city was burning and they couldn't stop it? That he'd had to make a decision an hour ago to let 6 residential buildings burn because he didn't have enough crews to cover them all? The reporter wisely retreated, but his photographer got a shot of Harris that would run on the front page the next day. A man with his face in his hands, the map of burning New York behind him, the physical embodiment of a city overwhelmed. The fires weren't random. Even in the chaos, patterns emerged. Certain types of buildings burned. Certain neighborhoods. The fires concentrated in areas that had been economically abandoned, where property values had collapsed, where insurance fraud was tempting and fire prevention systems had been neglected. Wealthy neighborhoods had sprinklers and modern electrical systems and buildings that were maintained to code. Poor neighborhoods had wiring from the 1920s, and landlords who couldn't afford repairs and wood that was dry as kindling after a summer heat wave. The fires were a physical manifestation of inequality. They burned along the fault lines of class and race, consuming the parts of the city that had already been written off by investors and politicians and city planners. And the cruel irony was that the people who lived in those neighborhoods, the ones who couldn't afford to leave, who were trapped by poverty and circumstance, were the ones who lost everything. Not the landlords who'd abandoned the buildings, not the businesses that had moved to the suburbs, the people who stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Maria Gonzalez stood in the street watching her apartment building burn. She'd lived there for 14 years, raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor. Everything she owned was in that building: furniture, clothes, photographs, the small savings she kept hidden in a coffee can because she didn't trust banks. She'd gotten out with her kids and nothing else, had run down 4 flights of stairs with her youngest in her arms and her older children clutching her shirt. Now they stood in pajamas on the sidewalk, watching flames pour from the windows of their home, and she was trying to figure out what came next. A firefighter approached and asked if she had somewhere to go. Family, friends, anywhere safe. Maria shook her head. Her family was in Puerto Rico. Her friends lived in the same building, were standing next to her now, also homeless. The firefighter told her about an emergency shelter being set up at a high school 3 blocks away. She could go there, get food and blankets, figure things out in the morning. Maria nodded but didn't move. Couldn't move. Her youngest daughter was crying, asking where they were going to sleep. Maria had no answer. For the first time in her life, she had no plan, no next step, no way forward. Just the street and the smoke and the terrible certainty that everything had changed. The firefighter, a young woman named Christine Blake, saw the paralysis setting in. She'd seen it before tonight, in other fires, other disasters. The moment when reality hits and people just stop, overwhelmed by the scope of what they've lost. Blake knelt down to talk to the youngest girl, asked her name, asked about her favorite stuffed animal. The girl said her favorite was a teddy bear named Mr. Buttons. But Mr. Buttons was upstairs in the burning apartment. Blake told her that Mr. Buttons was probably very brave, probably helping the other toys stay calm. The girl considered this seriously, then nodded. Blake stood and offered to walk the family to the shelter. She wasn't supposed to leave her post, but the building was clearly lost, and her crew was handling it, and these people needed help she could actually provide. So she walked 3 blocks with Maria and her children, carrying the youngest when the girl got tired, talking quietly about tomorrow and the day after and the way things sometimes got worse before they got better. She got them to the shelter, made sure they had blankets and water, and then walked back to the fire, back to her crew, back to the work that never seemed to end. By 4 a.m., some fires were starting to burn themselves out, not because they'd been extinguished, but because there was nothing left to burn. Buildings reduced to shells, stores reduced to ash and twisted metal. The fires had done what fire does, consumed everything combustible, and then starved in their own success. But new fires kept starting. A clothing store on Amsterdam Avenue, a warehouse in Red Hook, a row of brownstones in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The pattern had become predictable. Looting first, then fire. Then the slow realization that destroying your own neighborhood meant you had to live in the ruins. Lieutenant Morrison and Engine Company 277 had been fighting fires for 9 hours straight when they got the call about a nursing home in the South Bronx. The building was old, the residents mostly bedridden, and the fire had started in the kitchen and spread through the walls. Morrison's crew arrived to find nurses and orderlies trying to evacuate elderly patients, some on gurneys, some in wheelchairs, some confused and resistant. The smoke was already thick on the lower floors, fire climbing toward the upper levels where the most immobile patients were trapped. Morrison made the decision without hesitation. His entire crew went in, focusing on the upper floors, working in pairs to carry patients down narrow stairs filled with smoke. They got 43 people out. 43 elderly men and women who couldn't have saved themselves. They worked until their air tanks ran empty and then kept working on lung power and desperation. They got everyone out, every single person. And when it was done, when the building was empty and burning and they were standing in the street coughing up smoke and fighting the shakes that come after adrenaline fades, Morrison looked at his crew and felt something he hadn't felt all night. Pride. In the middle of all this destruction, they'd saved lives. That still meant something. But here's what the history books don't tell you. While Morrison's crew was saving the nursing home, 4 other buildings burned unchecked because there weren't enough firefighters to cover everything. One of those buildings was an apartment complex where a family of 6 died. Another was a small business that had been in the same location for 50 years, owned by a man who'd worked his entire life to build something, and who watched it burn to nothing while firefighters fought fires 3 blocks away. The math was brutal. Save 43 here, lose 10 there. No right answers, just choices and consequences. The sun would start rising in about 2 hours. The darkness that had hidden so much, enabled so much, would start giving way to light, and with that light would come a full accounting of what the city had done to itself. But right now, in the deep hours of early morning, the fires still burned, the smoke still rose, and firefighters still ran toward the flames, because that's what they'd sworn to do, even when the city was tearing itself apart around them. Meanwhile, in other neighborhoods, people were gathering on stoops and fire escapes, sharing what food they had, checking on elderly neighbors, forming informal watches to protect their blocks. The same darkness that brought out the worst in some brought out the best in others. The same blackout. The same city. 2 completely different responses, playing out simultaneously, proving that maybe New York wasn't one thing or the other. Maybe it was everything at once, generous and cruel, brave and cowardly, protecting and destroying, all of it true, all of it happening in the same 25 hours. The fires burned on, and the night was still dark. At Bellevue Hospital, the emergency generators kicked in 90 seconds after the blackout. 90 seconds of absolute darkness in a facility treating over 800 patients, many of them on life support, many of them in surgery, all of them suddenly vulnerable in ways that modern medicine wasn't designed to handle. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez was in the middle of closing a cardiac surgery patient when the lights died. The operating room went pitch black. The ventilator stopped. The heart monitor went silent. And for 90 seconds that felt like 90 hours, she worked by memory and touch, maintaining the patient's airway manually, keeping pressure on the surgical site, talking to her team in the darkness about what they'd do if the generators didn't catch. They did catch. The lights flickered back on, harsh and yellow on backup power. The ventilator resumed. The monitor showed a heartbeat, slower than it should be, but there. Rodriguez's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady as she finished closing. She'd completed the surgery. The patient would survive. But that 90-second gap had revealed something terrifying about how fragile everything was. How many points of failure existed between alive and dead? How quickly modern medicine could revert to primitive emergency care when the power failed. And that was just the first crisis. As the night progressed, Bellevue's backup generators started struggling under the load. The hospital had been designed with emergency power for essential systems, operating rooms, ICU, emergency department. But on a night this hot, with air conditioning failing and temperatures inside the building climbing past 90 degrees, with every ventilator and dialysis machine and monitoring system running simultaneously, the generators were being pushed beyond their rated capacity. The head of facilities, Martin Ochoa, watched the generator gauges creep into the red zone and made a decision that would save lives and haunt him. He started shutting down non-essential systems, air conditioning first, then regular lighting in the hallways, then the elevators. The hospital staff adapted. Nurses worked in the dim glow of emergency lighting, using flashlights for detailed work. Doctors performed examinations in the hallways because it was cooler than the rooms. The pharmacies scrambled to preserve medications that required refrigeration, packing them in ice that was melting faster than they could replace it. And in the ICU, where the most critical patients lived on machines, nurses took turns manually ventilating patients whose breathing tubes couldn't be trusted to automated systems that might fail if the generators gave out completely. Nurse Lillian Foster had been hand ventilating a stroke patient for 4 hours. Squeeze the bag, count to 3, release, breathe, squeeze again. Her rhythm never wavered, even as her arms cramped and her back screamed and sweat poured down her face in the stifling heat. Another nurse, Karen Chen, offered to take over. Foster shook her head. She'd started this. She'd keep going until the power came back or the patient could breathe on his own. Chen didn't argue, just brought water and wiped Foster's forehead and stayed close in case Foster collapsed. What Chen didn't know, what she wouldn't find out until days later, was that Foster had fractured her wrist earlier that evening, before the blackout, when she'd slipped on a wet floor in the medication room. She'd meant to get it x-rayed during her break. Then the lights went out and priorities shifted, and there were patients who needed her more than she needed medical attention. So she'd wrapped the wrist tight, taken some aspirin, and kept working. 4 hours of squeezing a ventilation bag with a broken wrist. 4 hours of maintaining the rhythm that kept a man breathing. When her supervisor finally discovered the injury days later and asked why she hadn't said anything, Foster would give the simplest answer: because he needed me more than I needed a cast. At Coney Island Hospital, the situation was more desperate. Their backup generator had failed completely 20 minutes into the blackout. Not a gradual failure. A catastrophic mechanical breakdown that left the entire hospital running on battery backup systems designed to last maybe an hour. The hospital administrator, Dr. Marcus Webb, faced an impossible decision. They had roughly 45 minutes of battery power left. After that, patients on ventilators would need manual breathing assistance. Patients on dialysis would have to be disconnected. Monitoring equipment would go dark. And they were still getting emergency patients from the chaos outside. People injured in the looting, burned in the fires, suffering from heat exhaustion and violence and accidents in the dark streets. Webb made the call to evacuate, but evacuating a hospital in the middle of a blackout, during citywide chaos, with limited ambulances and roads clogged with abandoned cars and broken traffic lights, it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. They prioritized the most critical patients first: ICU cases, post-surgical, newborns in the NICU. But moving critically ill people is dangerous under the best circumstances. In the dark, with limited equipment, with staff exhausted and scared, every transfer was a gamble. A team of nurses worked to transfer premature infants from the NICU, each baby in a portable incubator that ran on battery power for maybe 30 minutes. They had to move fast. Dr. Sarah Kim coordinated the transfer, checking each infant's vital signs before authorizing the move, making split-second decisions about who could be safely transported and who was too fragile to risk it. One infant, born at 26 weeks and weighing less than 2 pounds, was on a ventilator that couldn't be moved. Kim had to make a choice she'd never been trained for: leave the baby and hope the generator was fixed before the batteries died, or attempt a dangerous manual transfer with uncertain odds. She chose to keep the baby at Coney Island, assigned a respiratory therapist to manually ventilate if needed, prayed the repairs would happen in time, then moved to the next crisis, the next impossible choice, trying not to think about the baby she'd just left behind, trying to trust that she'd made the right call. The complexity of this night, heroes and villains in the same darkness, only gets deeper from here. Subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends, And if you lived through this or know someone who did, share what they experienced in the comments. At Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, a different crisis was unfolding. Their generators worked, but they were running low on diesel fuel. The fuel tank was supposed to be refilled every 3 days, but budget cuts had stretched the schedule to every 5 days, and the blackout had hit on day 4. They had maybe 6 hours of fuel left. After that, the generators would stop, and they'd be in the same situation as Coney Island. Hospital Administrator Patricia Morales was on the phone trying to arrange an emergency fuel delivery, but every fuel company in the city was overwhelmed with requests. Hospitals, police stations, fire departments, everyone needed diesel. And with traffic gridlocked and many gas stations unable to pump fuel without electricity, deliveries were nearly impossible. Morales had an idea that was either brilliant or desperate. She called every commercial trucking company she could find in the phone book, offering cash payment for any diesel they could provide. Most said no, but one dispatcher at a beverage distribution company said they had a truck with maybe 300 gallons that could be siphoned. It wasn't medical-grade diesel, it wasn't certified for hospital use, it wasn't approved by any of the regulations that normally govern such things. But it was fuel, and Morales took it. The truck arrived at 3:30 a.m., and maintenance workers siphoned diesel into the hospital generator while Morales stood watch, praying the improvised solution wouldn't blow up the generator and kill everyone. It worked. The generator kept running. Lincoln Hospital stayed powered. And Morales added one more violation to the list of rules broken that night in the service of keeping people alive. She'd face review boards later, questions about protocol and procedure, and why she hadn't followed proper channels. Her answer would be simple, because proper channels would have taken hours they didn't have, and people were dying. Sometimes you break the rules or people die. That's the choice. Not a good choice, just the only one. At Rikers Island, the city's main jail complex, the blackout created a different kind of crisis. Rikers held over 10,000 inmates in multiple facilities spread across the island. When the power failed, the electronic locks on some cell blocks malfunctioned. Not all of them, just enough to create chaos. Inmates in the affected blocks pushed open doors and flooded into corridors. Guards, outnumbered and working in the dark, fell back to secure positions and called for backup that was already stretched thin across the city. Captain Raymond Foster had been running Rikers for 12 years and had dealt with riots before. But a riot during a blackout, with limited backup and communication systems failing, was something new. He made the decision to isolate the affected cell blocks, sealing them off and letting the inmates have the run of those areas, while guards maintained control of the perimeters. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't even good. But it kept the situation from spreading to the entire complex. Inside the sealed blocks, inmates broke into the commissary, started fires in trash cans for light, settled old grudges with violence that guards couldn't prevent because they couldn't see what was happening. Foster radioed the city for support, for backup, for anyone who could help restore order. The response was blunt: handle it yourself. Every available officer was dealing with the chaos on the streets. Rikers was on its own. Foster looked at his skeleton crew of guards, at the sealed blocks where fights and fires were burning, and made his peace with the fact that some things were going to happen tonight that he couldn't stop. His job was to prevent escapes and keep the violence contained. Everything else was secondary. By dawn, 3 inmates would be seriously injured in fights. One would die, beaten to death in the darkness over a dispute about a card game that had happened 2 weeks earlier. The investigation would be inconclusive. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. The dark swallowed what happened, and the truth stayed buried. Foster would write the report, file the paperwork, and carry the knowledge that somewhere in his jail, A man had been murdered, while Foster's guards stood outside and did nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because the math didn't work. 30 guards couldn't control 10,000 inmates in the dark. Some things had to be accepted. Back at Bellevue, Dr. Rodriguez was dealing with a new crisis. A gunshot victim had just arrived, hit during a robbery attempt in the Blackout. The man was bleeding out, needed immediate surgery, but the operating rooms were all occupied. Rodriguez made the decision to operate in the emergency department, right there in the trauma bay, with emergency lighting and portable equipment and conditions that would horrify any medical inspector. Her team set up a makeshift surgical suite, sterilized what they could, and went to work while paramedics brought in more patients. Burns, injuries, overdoses, all the chaos of the streets made flesh. She saved the gunshot victim, removed the bullet, repaired the damage, stabilized him for transfer to the ICU once a bed opened up. Then she moved to the next patient, a woman with severe burns from one of the fires. Then another patient, a man beaten during a looting incident. The night became a blur of blood and sweat, and decisions made in seconds that normally took hours of consultation. Emergency medicine at its most raw, stripped down to the essential question, what do I need to do right now to keep this person from dying? At some point, she became aware that she'd been on her feet for 12 hours, that she hadn't eaten since dinner the previous evening, that her hands were cramping and her vision was blurring from exhaustion. But there were still patients coming in, still people who needed help. So she kept working, running on adrenaline and the terrible clarity that comes from knowing you're the only thing standing between someone and death. A medical student working with her, a young man named David Park on his first clinical rotation, asked how she kept going. Rodriguez looked at him, this kid who'd chosen medicine because he wanted to help people and was now seeing exactly what that meant in practice, and told him the truth. You don't think about being tired. You don't think about how hard it is. You think about the next patient. Just the next one. And then the one after that. And somehow you get through. Park would remember that conversation for his entire career. Would repeat it to his own students decades later when he was teaching emergency medicine. Would understand eventually that what Rodriguez had really taught him that night wasn't about stamina or dedication. It was about the fundamental bargain of medicine. You give what you have, even when you have nothing left to give, because someone's life depends on it. Not heroic, just necessary. In the cardiac unit at Mount Sinai, a patient coded at 4:15 a.m. His heart stopped, monitors screaming, nurses rushing to start CPR. But the crash cart, the mobile unit with defibrillator and emergency drugs, was on the other side of the floor, and in the darkness and chaos, it took precious minutes to locate. By the time they got the cart to the patient and delivered the first shock, he'd been in cardiac arrest for over 3 minutes. Brain damage becomes likely after 4 to 6 minutes. They got his heart started again. But the delay might have cost him his cognitive function, might have meant saving a life but losing the person. The nurse who'd been searching for the crash cart, Gloria Martinez, sat in the break room afterward and cried. Not dramatic sobbing, just silent tears running down her face while she drank terrible coffee and tried to process what had happened. Another nurse, an older woman named Betty Williams, sat with her and didn't say anything comforting. Didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. Just sat there in the darkness with her, bearing witness to the grief of knowing you did everything you could and it might not have been enough. These were the stories that wouldn't make the news, the quiet tragedies playing out in hospitals across the city. The patients who died because equipment failed or supplies ran out or exhausted staff made mistakes that would haunt them. The staff who worked until they collapsed, then got up and worked some more. The impossible decisions made in the dark by people who'd never trained for this, never expected to face circumstances this extreme. But there were also miracles. A baby born in the darkness at Brooklyn Hospital, delivered by flashlight with a doctor who'd been on shift for 16 hours. Mother and child both survived, both healthy, both unaware of how close they'd come to being a tragedy instead of a triumph. A dialysis patient at Queens Hospital who should have died when the power failed but didn't, saved by a nurse who manually operated the dialysis machine for 8 hours straight until the generators came back online. A suicide attempt victim brought to NYU Hospital who survived because the emergency room staff refused to give up, performing CPR for 40 minutes until they got a heartbeat back. These miracles happened because people refused to accept that the blackout meant normal rules applied. Because nurses work with broken wrists, and doctors operated in hallways, and administrators broke regulations to get fuel. Because when systems failed, humans stepped in to become the system. Not perfectly, not without cost, but enough to save lives that otherwise would have been lost. As dawn approached, the hospitals were still running on fumes and desperation. Generators that should have failed were somehow still running. Staff who should have collapsed were somehow still working. And patients who should have died were somehow still breathing. The night had revealed that modern medicine was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. But it had also revealed that the people providing that care were stronger than they knew. Dr. Rodriguez finally sat down at 5:30 a.m. in a chair in an empty hallway and let herself feel the exhaustion. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her back was screaming. She was pretty sure she'd torn something in her shoulder during the surgery. But she'd made it. They'd all made it. The shift wasn't over. Wouldn't be over until the power came back and the crisis ended, but they'd survived the worst of it. She closed her eyes for just a moment, just to rest them, and immediately fell asleep sitting up, too tired to even dream. And the sun was starting to rise. The sun rose over New York City at 5:47 a.m. on July 14, 1977. And with it came the first clear view of what the darkness had hidden. From helicopters circling above, news cameras captured images that would define the blackout in public memory. Entire blocks reduced to smoking ruins, streets carpeted with broken glass, stores gutted and empty like mouths with their teeth knocked out. The South Bronx looked like a war zone. Parts of Bushwick looked worse. The damage stretched for miles, concentrated in neighborhoods that had already been struggling, now dealt a blow that many would never fully recover from. On the ground, the scene was even more devastating. Samuel Rodriguez, the bodega owner who defended his store with a baseball bat, stood in his doorway at dawn and surveyed his block. Of the 19 stores that had been operating yesterday, 14 were destroyed. The pharmacy where his neighbors got their prescriptions was a burned-out shell. The grocery store where families shopped was picked clean and torched. The hardware store that had been there since the 1940s was gone. Just gone. Nothing left but scorched walls and the smell of chemical fire. Rodriguez's store had survived, but the neighborhood it served had been gutted. He watched the sun climb higher and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with property or money. This was his community. These were his neighbors. And in one night they'd turned on themselves, destroyed what little they had, burned down the infrastructure that made life bearable in a place that was already hard. He understood the anger. He understood the desperation. But understanding didn't make the ruins any less ruinous. A few blocks away, Angela Martinez, the mother who'd taken groceries during the looting, walked through the neighborhood with her children in the early morning light. Her youngest daughter asked why all the stores were broken. Martinez didn't have an answer that made sense. She'd participated in the looting, had taken what she needed to feed her family, but seeing the aftermath in daylight made her stomach turn. The Food King supermarket where she'd taken groceries was completely destroyed. Not just looted, but systematically demolished. Someone had driven a car through the front window. Someone had set fire to the back storage area. The damage was so complete, it looked intentional. vindictive, like the building itself had done something to deserve this. Her daughter found a stuffed animal in the debris, a teddy bear, singed but intact, asked if she could keep it. Martinez wanted to say no, wanted to teach the right lesson about taking things that didn't belong to you. But what lesson made sense anymore? She'd already crossed that line last night. They all had. She let her daughter keep the bear and kept walking, stepping over broken glass and scattered merchandise, wondering what came next for a neighborhood that had just burned down its own infrastructure. At the 77th Precinct in Crown Heights, the morning shift arrived to find the station overwhelmed with arrestees. They'd been bringing people in all night, processing them as fast as possible, but the numbers were staggering. Over 300 people crammed into holding cells designed for maybe 50. The overflow was being held in the parking garage, in interrogation rooms, anywhere with a door that locked. Sergeant James Mitchell, who'd been on duty since the blackout started, was trying to organize the chaos into something resembling procedure. The problem was the sheer volume. They had people arrested for everything from taking a candy bar to burning down buildings. They had teenagers and grandmothers. They had people caught with stolen goods and people who'd been arrested simply for being in the wrong place when the police showed up. Processing them all, documenting evidence, preparing cases for prosecution, it was going to take weeks, months. And the legal system was already groaning under normal loads. This was going to break it. Mitchell's captain, Vincent Torres, arrived at 6 a.m. and took one look at the situation before calling downtown for instructions. What came back was essentially a shrug. Do your best. Document what you can. The DA's office would figure out how to prosecute later. Right now, the priority was just getting people logged and detained. Torres hung up the phone and looked at Mitchell with an expression that said everything about how this was going to go. They were making it up as they went along. No playbook for this, no procedure that covered arresting thousands of people in one night. The prisoners themselves were a cross-section of the city. In one holding cell, a 17-year-old sat next to a 45-year-old grandmother, both arrested for looting the same electronics store. The kid had taken a television. The grandmother had taken a microwave because hers had broken 2 months ago, and she couldn't afford to replace it. They didn't talk to each other, didn't make eye contact, just sat on opposite benches in the crowded cell, each processing their own version of what had happened and what it meant. At 7:23 a.m., a Con Edison crew finally isolated the problem that had prevented a quick restart of the power grid. The cascade failure had damaged multiple substations, and until those were repaired or bypassed, they couldn't safely restore power to the whole city. It was going to take hours more, maybe into the afternoon. The crew worked through the morning heat, already climbing back into the 90s, making repairs, testing systems, coordinating with power plants across the region to sequence the restart properly. John Morrison, the control room operator who'd watched the cascade failure in real time, was still at his station. He'd been there for over 12 hours, running on coffee and adrenaline, coordinating the restart efforts. His supervisor, Margaret Chen, had sent him home twice. He'd refused both times. This was his grid, his responsibility. He'd watched it fail, and he was going to be there when it came back online. Chen understood. She'd have done the same thing. So she brought him more coffee and let him work. At 10:39 p.m., exactly 25 hours after the blackout began, power started returning to New York City in carefully controlled stages, not all at once. That would risk another cascade. Instead, Con Edison brought neighborhoods online section by section, monitoring loads, adjusting supply, making sure the grid could handle the demand before adding more. Morrison watched the board light up green, one section at a time, and felt something in his chest unclench. They'd done it. The city had power again. But having power didn't erase what had happened in the darkness. Across the 5 boroughs, people were waking up to the full scope of the damage. Stores that had been family businesses for generations were gone. Apartment buildings were uninhabitable. Entire blocks looked like they'd been bombed. The official count would eventually tally 616 stores damaged or destroyed, over 1,000 fires, and $300 million in property damage, roughly $1.5 billion in today's dollars. But those numbers didn't capture the psychological damage, the community trust that had been broken, the sense of security that had evaporated. In Bushwick, residents emerged from their apartments to find their neighborhood transformed. Streets they'd walked for years were now obstacle courses of broken glass and debris. Marcus, the teenager who'd thrown the first brick, stood on his fire escape and looked at the damage with a sick feeling in his stomach. The electronics store was completely gone. The clothing boutique next to it was burned. The grocery store across the street was a gutted shell. He'd been part of this. He'd helped start it. And now he had to live with what that meant. His mother found him there, staring at the ruins. She didn't lecture, didn't yell, just asked him one question. Was it worth it? Marcus looked at the portable radio he'd stolen, sitting in his room, gathering dust. He'd thought taking it would feel like power, like getting something back from a city that had taken from him. But looking at the destroyed neighborhood, he realized the city hadn't taken this from him. He'd taken it from himself. From his neighbors. From the community that was supposed to be home. The radio wasn't worth it. Nothing he'd taken was worth this. But here's what the damage reports couldn't quantify. The psychological break between neighbors who'd looted together and now had to live next to each other. Both knowing, both pretending not to know. Rodriguez, the bodega owner, had recognized faces in the looting crowds. People who shopped in his store. People he'd extended credit to. People he'd considered friends. How was he supposed to serve them now? How were they supposed to look him in the eye? The social fabric of the neighborhood hadn't just frayed. In some places, it had torn completely, and nobody knew if it could be repaired. At Bellevue Hospital, the staff was finally getting relief as the day shift arrived, and the emergency began to wind down. Dr. Rodriguez clocked out at noon, having worked for 18 hours straight. She walked out of the hospital into brutal sunlight and heat, still in her scrubs, and felt like she'd been in a different world. The city outside looked normal. Traffic moving, people walking, life continuing. But she'd just come from a place where people had died, where systems had failed, where the thin margin between civilization and chaos had been tested to its absolute limit. She went home. Took a shower that lasted until the hot water ran out. Lay down in her bed and couldn't sleep because every time she closed her eyes she saw the faces of patients she'd treated, heard the alarms, felt the pressure of decisions made in seconds. The blackout was over, but for her the aftermath was just beginning. The review boards, the documentation, the questions about every choice she'd made. And underneath it all, the knowledge that she'd saved lives but couldn't save them all. That success and failure had existed simultaneously in the same night. The same hands. The same heart. The city began the process of cleaning up, but some neighborhoods faced challenges that went beyond sweeping glass and boarding windows. In the South Bronx, where fires had raged unchecked for hours, entire blocks were too dangerous to enter. Buildings had collapsed. Others were structurally unsound. The city condemned dozens of properties, forcing residents to relocate, adding to a homelessness crisis that was already overwhelming the shelter system. Maria Gonzalez and her children, who'd lost their apartment to fire, ended up in a high school gymnasium converted to emergency housing, sleeping on cots alongside hundreds of other displaced families. The makeshift shelter was chaos. No privacy, no security. Families crammed together, children crying, adults arguing. everyone traumatized and displaced and uncertain about the future. Volunteers from churches and community organizations brought food and clothes and tried to provide some organization, but it was overwhelming. Social workers attempted to process everyone, to figure out housing placements, but there simply weren't enough apartments available. Not affordable ones. Not in neighborhoods that hadn't been destroyed. Gonzalez and her family would spend 3 weeks in that gymnasium before finding a new apartment. Smaller, more expensive, in a worse neighborhood. The blackout had been one night. The consequences would last years. The police were still processing arrests days after the blackout ended. The final count reached 776 people arrested in 25 hours. The largest mass arrest in New York City history. The courts were completely overwhelmed. Arraignments were happening around the clock, judges working in shifts, public defenders handling dozens of cases simultaneously. The system ground along, but it was breaking under the load. Many cases would take months to get to trial. Some would be dismissed for lack of evidence or procedural errors. Some people arrested for minor theft would end up with criminal records that would haunt them for decades. Captain Torres at the 77th Precinct watched the prosecution process unfold and felt the injustice of it. People arrested for taking diapers were facing the same charges as people who'd burned buildings. Teenagers caught up in the chaos were being prosecuted as adults. And the whole thing had a racial dimension that was impossible to ignore. The vast majority of those arrested were Black and Latino, from the poorest neighborhoods, while wealthier areas had experienced almost no looting, and therefore almost no arrests. The system was supposed to deliver justice. Instead, it was delivering punishment based on zip code. By the end of July, 2 weeks after the blackout, certain patterns had emerged in the recovery. Affluent neighborhoods had bounced back quickly. Stores reopened. Life resumed. But in places like Bushwick and the South Bronx, the damage was lasting. Insurance companies were slow to pay claims, if they paid at all. Many store owners couldn't afford to rebuild. Landlords abandoned properties that had been damaged, leaving residents in uninhabitable buildings. The blackout had exposed and accelerated a process of urban decay that had been happening for years. Some businesses never reopened. The electronics store where Marcus had thrown the first brick stayed empty, becoming a gathering spot for drug dealers and eventually getting condemned. The pharmacy that served 3,000 residents was gone, forcing elderly people to travel miles for medications. The grocery store didn't come back, creating a food desert in a neighborhood that already struggled with access to fresh food. The economic damage rippled outward. Jobs lost, tax revenue vanished, services cut because there was no money to fund them. But there were also stories of resilience. Rodriguez kept his bodega open, even serving customers he'd seen in the looting crowds. Because what else was he going to do? Close down? Let them win? He stayed, he rebuilt. He extended credit again to people who probably didn't deserve it, because that's what it meant to be part of a community, even one that had betrayed him. Angela Martinez volunteered at the emergency shelter, helping families who'd lost everything, trying to give back something to balance out what she'd taken. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it was something. The fire department compiled its final statistics: 1,037 fires in 25 hours, 25 fires per hour, 1 fire every 2.5 minutes. Lieutenant Morrison and his crew at Engine Company 277 had responded to 36 fires that night. 36. They'd saved the nursing home. They'd lost other buildings. The math was brutal. But they'd done what they could. Morrison would receive a commendation for his actions during the blackout. He'd put it in a drawer and never look at it again. because all he could think about was the woman who died on the 5th floor while he stood in the street making the decision not to send his crew into a collapsing building. At the hospitals, the equipment that had failed was being replaced or upgraded. Generator systems were being tested more rigorously. Fuel supplies were being increased. The blackout had revealed weaknesses that might have killed people if the staff hadn't compensated through sheer determination. But it also revealed that systems could be fixed. Nurse Foster's broken wrist was in a cast. Dr. Rodriguez was back to normal surgery schedules. The premature baby at Coney Island had survived, was growing stronger, would eventually go home with his parents who'd never know how close they'd come to losing him. The psychological toll was harder to measure. PTSD wasn't well understood in 1977, especially not for medical staff who were expected to just handle whatever came. But Foster had nightmares about patients coding in the dark. Rodriguez had panic attacks when the lights flickered. The hospital administration offered no counseling, no support. That wasn't part of the culture. You dealt with it. You moved on. You showed up for your next shift and did the job. Years later, when trauma support became standard for medical personnel, Foster would participate in programs for young nurses and talk openly about that night, about the cost of caring, about the weight that healthcare workers carry, about the need to acknowledge that saving lives sometimes breaks the people doing the saving. As July turned to August and the immediate crisis faded, New York began the harder work of understanding what had happened and why. The official investigations focused on the technical failures, the lightning strike, the cascade, the failed protective systems. But the deeper question was why the 1977 blackout had produced such different results than the 1965 blackout. Why looting and arson instead of community spirit and mutual aid? The answer was complex, uncomfortable, and politically charged. But it couldn't be ignored. The city in 1977 was not the city of 1965. 12 years had brought white flight, economic decline, budget crises, service cuts, and a sense of abandonment in communities that were already struggling. Unemployment in young Black and Latino populations hit 40% in some neighborhoods. The city had laid off thousands of police officers and firefighters in budget cuts. Buildings were being abandoned at a rate of thousands per year. The social contract, the idea that if you worked hard and followed the rules, the system would provide opportunity, had broken for huge segments of the population. The blackout didn't create those problems. It was more like a diagnostic test, and the city failed. The darkness revealed fractures that had been spreading for years, divisions that electric light had only hidden, not healed. When the power went out and the normal structures of enforcement disappeared, what emerged wasn't random chaos. It was targeted rage. People didn't loot their own homes. They looted businesses they felt had been exploiting them. They burned buildings owned by landlords who'd let them deteriorate. The violence had purpose, even if that purpose was destructive. Understanding this didn't excuse what happened. 25 people had died during the blackout. Some in fires, some in accidents, some in violence. Hundreds were injured. Thousands were traumatized. The property damage was real. The destroyed businesses had been people's livelihoods, their dreams, their investments. The damage to community trust was immeasurable. But understanding the context, the years of economic abandonment, the structural racism, the desperation, was necessary if the city wanted to prevent it from happening again. And maybe that was the most important lesson of July 13, 1977, that darkness reveals what light obscures. That social problems ignored don't disappear, they accumulate. That a city can't abandon its poorest neighborhoods for years and then be shocked when those neighborhoods erupt in crisis. The blackout was 25 hours of darkness. But what it illuminated about inequality, urban decay, and social fracture would remain visible for decades. The sun had risen, the power was back on, but the work of rebuilding, not just buildings, but trust, community, hope, was just beginning, and some of what was broken that night would never fully heal. To understand what happened in New York on July 13, 1977, you have to go back further than the lightning strike. You have to go back to October 1975, when the city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy and President Gerald Ford refused federal assistance. The Daily News summarized his position in a headline that became infamous: "Ford to city, drop dead." That wasn't just a rejection of a bailout. It was a message that New York was on its own, that the federal government had written off America's largest city, that whatever happened next was the city's problem to solve. The solution involved brutal cuts. The city laid off thousands of workers: police officers, firefighters, teachers, sanitation workers. Services that residents had taken for granted disappeared or diminished. Garbage piled up during strikes. Fire response times increased. Police presence in certain neighborhoods became almost non-existent. The budget crisis didn't affect all neighborhoods equally. Wealthy areas maintained services through private security and community resources. Poor neighborhoods, the ones that needed public services most, were gutted. In Bushwick, the police precinct went from 80 officers to 45. Response times to emergency calls tripled. Property crime went largely unprosecuted because the courts were overwhelmed and the police couldn't spare resources for anything that wasn't immediately life-threatening. Residents watched their neighborhood deteriorate and understood that they'd been abandoned by the city government. The social contract, you pay taxes, we provide services, had broken down, and people noticed. The economic collapse hit hardest in communities of color. In 1977, unemployment for young black men in the South Bronx reached 43%. Not a recession number, a depression number. An entire generation was being locked out of the economy, watching jobs disappear to the suburbs, watching businesses close, watching opportunity evaporate. The civil rights movement had promised equality. The reality was concentrated poverty, failing schools, and a sense that the system had no place for them. Reverend Thomas Washington, who'd stood on his church steps during the blackout trying to prevent looting, had watched this economic devastation unfold over years. He'd seen young people in his congregation graduate high school with no job prospects, seen families evicted because they couldn't make rent on minimum wage jobs that didn't cover the cost of living, seen the hope drain out of a community that had believed, wanted to believe, that hard work and education would lead to something better. When that belief died, what replaced it was anger. Justified anger. Washington tried to channel that anger constructively. His church ran job training programs, literacy classes, community organizing efforts. But you can't organize your way out of structural unemployment. You can't educate your way out of an economy that has no jobs to offer. The programs helped individuals, but they couldn't fix the systemic problems that were destroying the neighborhood. And the blackout had revealed what happens when enough people lose hope simultaneously. Not organized protest, but chaotic rage. The white flight that had started in the 1960s had accelerated through the 70s. Middle-class families, mostly white, but also Black and Latino families who could afford to leave, moved to the suburbs. They took their property taxes with them. The city's tax base collapsed while its service obligations remained. The people who stayed were disproportionately poor, elderly, or trapped by circumstances. And the neighborhoods they stayed in deteriorated rapidly as landlords abandoned buildings, businesses closed, and the infrastructure crumbled. In the South Bronx, landlords had discovered a perverse incentive. A deteriorating building in a declining neighborhood was worth more destroyed than maintained. Insurance paid more than the building could sell for, so landlords stopped making repairs, stopped providing heat, stopped paying property taxes. They'd let the building deteriorate until the city condemned it or until it burned, sometimes accidentally, often deliberately. Then they'd collect insurance and walk away. The city would be left with another abandoned building, another empty lot, another missing tooth in the neighborhood's smile. This practice had a name: benign neglect. The term came from a policy memo suggesting that the Negro problem would benefit from a period of benign neglect by the federal government. The idea was that black communities would be better served by less government intervention, less attention, less assistance. In practice, it meant abandonment. It meant watching neighborhoods burn and calling it policy. It meant structural racism dressed up in the language of economic efficiency. The blackout didn't create benign neglect. The blackout was what happened when benign neglect met a crisis. Years of disinvestment meant that when stores were looted, they couldn't afford to rebuild. Years of deteriorating buildings meant that fires spread faster and burned hotter. Years of reduced police presence meant that when chaos erupted, there weren't enough officers to respond. The darkness just revealed fractures that had been spreading for years, growing in the shadows while people looked away. But the economic problems were only part of the story. New York in the summer of 1977 was also in the grip of terror. The son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz, had been shooting young people since July 1976. By the night of the blackout, he'd killed 6 people and wounded 7 others. The randomness of the attacks created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. You could be shot just for sitting in a car with someone you cared about, just for being young and alive in New York City. The psychological impact was enormous. People changed their behavior, avoided certain neighborhoods, stayed home at night. The city felt dangerous in a way that went beyond normal urban crime, and the police seemed powerless to stop it. They had task forces, investigations, tips pouring in. But Berkowitz kept shooting, kept sending letters to newspapers, taunting the police, kept creating an atmosphere of fear that saturated the summer heat like humidity. When the blackout hit, that fear was already there, humming in the background of everything. The darkness magnified it. If the son of Sam could shoot people in broad daylight, what could happen in total darkness? If the police couldn't catch one serial killer, how could they control an entire city in chaos? The blackout revealed what people already suspected: that safety was an illusion, that order was thin, that the structures protecting them were more fragile than they wanted to believe. The convergence of all these factors — economic collapse, racial tension, urban decay, generalized fear — created conditions that needed only a spark. The lightning strike at 9:34 p.m. on July 13th was that spark. But the fuel had been accumulating for years. The blackout didn't cause New York's problems. It was more like a diagnostic test, and the city failed. The darkness revealed fractures that electric light had been hiding, divisions that couldn't be ignored anymore. There's a photograph from the morning after the blackout that captures something essential about what happened. It shows 2 streets in New York, photographed the same morning, maybe 5 miles apart. The first street is on the Upper East Side. Clean sidewalks, intact storefronts, people going about their morning routines like nothing had happened. The second street is in Bushwick. Shattered glass everywhere, burned buildings, empty shelves visible through broken windows, smoke still rising from ruins. Same blackout. Same 25 hours of darkness. Completely different results. That photograph said more about New York in 1977 than any official report could. It showed a city divided not just by economics or race, but by experience. Some neighborhoods had experienced the blackout as an inconvenience, an adventure, a story to tell at dinner parties. Other neighborhoods had experienced it as a breakdown of social order, a revelation of how little held their world together, a trauma that would echo for decades. Two cities in one. Two realities existing side by side, separated by geography and circumstance, and a gulf of understanding that neither side knew how to bridge. The media coverage reflected and reinforced these divisions. Newspapers ran stories about the animals and criminals who destroyed their own neighborhoods, with photos of Black and Latino men carrying stolen goods, with language that dehumanized entire communities. The coverage rarely mentioned unemployment rates or budget cuts or decades of disinvestment. It focused on individual morality, on personal responsibility, on the failure of character that would lead someone to loot a store during a blackout. What got lost in that narrative was context, not excuses. What happened during the blackout was wrong, destructive, often criminal. But context matters when you're trying to understand cause and effect. A teenager who loots an electronics store is making a choice, yes. But that choice doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of 40% unemployment, failing schools, abandoned buildings, and a society that seems to have given up on the neighborhood entirely. Understanding that context doesn't excuse the looting, but it does explain why 1977 was different from 1965. Some voices tried to inject that context into the public conversation. Civil rights leaders, community organizers, academics who studied urban poverty. But they were drowned out by simpler narratives about law and order, about personal responsibility, about the need for tougher policing and harsher penalties. The political response to the blackout would be more police, more arrests, more incarceration, not more jobs, not more investment, not addressing the structural problems that had created the conditions for the chaos. The city would choose punishment over prevention. Mayor Abraham Beame, who was already politically weakened by the city's fiscal crisis, took the full force of the public anger about the blackout. His administration had presided over the budget cuts, the service reductions, the deterioration of city infrastructure. When the blackout revealed the consequences of those choices, voters held him accountable. He would lose the next election to Ed Koch, who campaigned on a platform of law and order, of restoring discipline to a city that seemed to be spiraling into chaos. Koch would be a transformative mayor, but not in ways that helped the communities most damaged by the blackout. He would focus on Midtown Manhattan, on courting business investment, on making the city attractive to tourists and corporations. The outer boroughs, the places that had burned during the blackout, would continue to struggle, continue to deteriorate, continue to be treated as problems to contain rather than communities to invest in. The divisions that the blackout had exposed would deepen, not heal. The blackout also exposed divisions within communities. Rodriguez, the bodega owner who'd defended his store, had to live with knowing which of his neighbors had tried to loot it. Angela Martinez, who'd taken groceries, had to live with knowing she'd participated in destroying her neighborhood's infrastructure. These weren't abstract moral questions. They were daily realities. Encounters in the street, interactions at the store, the constant presence of shame and resentment and unspoken knowledge. Some communities tried to address this directly. Church meetings where people talked about what happened, community forums where residents discussed how to rebuild trust. But many people just buried it, pretended it hadn't happened, created a collective amnesia about that night because confronting it was too painful, too complicated, too revealing of divisions they didn't know how to heal. The silence itself became a wound, an unaddressed trauma that would fester in the community's memory. Marcus, the teenager who'd thrown the first brick, tried to apologize to the electronics store owner a week after the blackout. He went to where the store had been, now just a burned shell, and found the owner there, surveying the damage, trying to figure out if insurance would cover rebuilding. Marcus introduced himself, said he'd been part of what happened, said he was sorry. The owner looked at him for a long moment, then said simply, "Sorry doesn't rebuild my store," and walked away. Marcus stood there in the ruins of what he'd helped destroy and understood that some things couldn't be undone. The apology didn't make him feel better. It didn't absolve him. It just made the weight of what he'd done more concrete, more real. He'd spent his whole life in this neighborhood. His mother still lived here. He'd have to pass this empty lot every day, see this reminder of his choices, carry this knowledge of what he was capable of when the lights went out and nobody was watching. But the economic incentives that had encouraged landlords to abandon buildings, that had made insurance fraud profitable, that had created food deserts and job deserts and hope deserts, those didn't change. The blackout had revealed them, but revelation doesn't equal solution. The same forces that had been hollowing out poor neighborhoods before the blackout continued after it. If anything, the blackout accelerated the process. More businesses closed. More landlords walked away. More families left if they could, stayed if they couldn't. Reverend Washington preached a sermon the Sunday after the blackout about sin and redemption, about community responsibility, about the need to rebuild not just buildings but relationships. The church was packed. People came looking for meaning, for guidance, for some way to process what had happened. Washington spoke about the economic conditions that created desperation, but he also spoke about personal choices, about the moment where each person had decided whether to participate in the destruction or resist it. He didn't offer easy answers, didn't blame everyone or absolve everyone. Instead, he talked about the complexity of living in a society that abandons you while still demanding you follow its rules. About the justified anger at systemic injustice and the unjustified choice to destroy your own neighborhood. About how both things could be true simultaneously, that the system had failed these communities and that the communities had failed themselves. The congregation listened in silence, and when it was over, nobody felt resolved, just heard, seen, understood in their complexity. The blackout hadn't created New York's problems. It was more like an X-ray, revealing bone-deep fractures that had been spreading in the darkness, growing in spaces people didn't want to look. The question wasn't really why the blackout happened. Lightning strikes. Systems fail. The question was, why New York in 1977 responded so differently than New York in 1965? And the answer was written in unemployment statistics, abandoned buildings, budget cuts, and a decade of treating entire communities as disposable. Understanding that doesn't excuse what happened. 25 people died. Thousands of businesses were destroyed. Communities were traumatized. The damage was real and wrong and preventable. But understanding the causes, the deep, structural, years-in-the-making causes, is necessary if the goal is to prevent it from happening again. Not just to punish the individuals who participated, but to address the conditions that made mass destruction seem like a reasonable response to darkness. As summer turned to fall and the immediate aftermath of the blackout faded into memory, New York faced a choice about what lessons to draw. Would it invest in the communities that had been damaged, address the economic abandonment that had created desperation? Or would it focus on punishment, on more police, on treating the symptoms while ignoring the disease? The city chose punishment, chose law and order over economic investment, chose to treat the blackout as a failure of individual morality rather than a systemic breakdown. That choice would have consequences that echoed for decades. The neighborhoods that burned in 1977 would take 30 years to recover. Some never fully did. The divisions the blackout exposed would widen, not narrow. And the lessons that might have been learned about inequality, about abandonment, about what happens when communities are left to fester in the dark, would be forgotten in favor of simpler stories about crime and punishment. The blackout didn't create New York's problems, it just turned on the lights long enough to see them clearly. And then the lights came back on, and people looked away again, and the problems kept growing in the darkness. The criminal justice system was never designed to process 776 arrests in 25 hours. The normal procedures, booking, arraignment, bail hearings, preliminary investigations, assumed a steady flow of cases spread across days and weeks. What the blackout delivered was a flood. Every precinct was overwhelmed. Every jail was overcrowded. Every courtroom was running around the clock. And the people caught in this system, many of them teenagers, many arrested for minor theft, some just in the wrong place when the police showed up, were about to discover that justice during a crisis looks very different from justice under normal circumstances. The arraignment started the morning after the blackout and continued for weeks. Judges processed cases in assembly line fashion, spending maybe 5 minutes per person, setting bail or releasing on recognizance based on the thinnest evidence. Public defenders met their clients for the first time in the courtroom, had no time to review case files or gather evidence, could offer only the most cursory representation. The presumption of innocence, the foundation of American criminal justice, got reduced to a formality when the system was processing hundreds of cases per day. Marcus, the teenager who'd thrown the first brick, was arraigned 3 days after his arrest. He'd spent those 3 days in a holding cell at the 79th Precinct with 20 other people, sleeping on a concrete floor, eating sandwiches that were handed through the bars twice a day. Nobody had explained his rights. Nobody had told him what he was charged with. When they finally brought him to court, the judge looked at the paperwork for maybe 30 seconds before setting bail at $500. Marcus's mother, watching from the gallery, felt her stomach drop. $500 might as well have been $5,000. She didn't have it. Didn't know where to get it. The bail bondsman wanted 10% cash. $50 she also didn't have. So Marcus went back to jail, to a cell on Rikers Island this time, to wait for a trial date that wouldn't come for 8 months. 8 months of his life frozen because his family couldn't afford $50. The inequality was built into the system, invisible to anyone who'd never experienced it. The cases themselves revealed the arbitrary nature of who got arrested and for what. Some people were caught with stolen goods worth thousands, televisions, furniture, entire shopping carts full of merchandise. Others were arrested for taking food, diapers, necessities they couldn't afford. The charges were often the same: grand larceny, burglary, criminal mischief, but the circumstances were wildly different. A mother taking formula to feed her baby faced the same legal consequences as someone who'd burned down a store. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Winters was assigned to prosecute several hundred blackout cases. She'd been with the DA's office for 6 years, had handled everything from shoplifting to murder, considered herself fair-minded and pragmatic. But the blackout cases troubled her. The evidence was often weak, officers making arrests in the chaos, documenting what they could, but without witnesses or clear proof of who'd taken what. Many arrests were based on circumstantial evidence: person seen near a store with broken windows, carrying merchandise that might have come from that store. Winter started reviewing the cases individually and found patterns that made her uncomfortable. A 17-year-old arrested for having a portable radio worth maybe $20. A grandmother arrested for taking a microwave. A father arrested for carrying groceries. These weren't hardened criminals. These were desperate people who'd made poor choices during extraordinary circumstances. She knew she could probably get convictions. The defendants couldn't afford good lawyers. Judges were in a punitive mood. Juries were angry about the blackout. But should she? She brought her concerns to her supervisor, asking whether the office should exercise more discretion, drop some of the minor cases, focus on the serious offenses. Her supervisor's response was blunt. The city wants accountability. The mayor wants arrests and convictions. The public wants to see consequences. Prosecuting these cases isn't about individual justice. It's about sending a message that lawlessness won't be tolerated. Winters understood the logic. She also understood that the message would fall hardest on the poorest people, the ones least able to defend themselves. Among the thousands arrested was a 16-year-old who'd taken a turntable and mixer from a music store on Jerome Avenue. His name was Joseph Sadler, though the world would eventually know him as Grandmaster Flash. The equipment he'd stolen would help birth hip-hop, as the genre moved from parks and parties into recorded music. Years later, Sadler would talk about that night, with a mixture of shame and defiance. Shame at the theft, defiance at a system that had given him no legal path to pursue his passion, no way to afford the tools he needed to create. The blackout created origin stories like that. Cultural movements emerging from destruction, creativity born from chaos. DJs across the city had acquired equipment during the looting. Some of that equipment would launch careers, establish a genre that would reshape global music culture. The morality was complicated. The theft was wrong. But the results, the art, the culture, the voice given to communities that had been silenced, were transformative. Sometimes history turns on moments of moral ambiguity, and the blackout provided plenty of those. The insurance claims began flooding in within days of the blackout. Over $300 million in property damage. But insurance companies, seeing the scale of the claims, started looking for ways to deny coverage. They argued that riots weren't covered under standard policies, that the blackout constituted a civil disturbance, not criminal activity. That proving individual losses was impossible when entire stores had been emptied. Store owners who'd paid premiums for years found themselves fighting with insurance adjusters who suddenly couldn't remember coverage details. Benjamin Katz, the landlord who'd burned his own building for the insurance money, filed his claim with confidence. He had documentation. Photos of the building before the fire. A policy that clearly covered fire damage. But the insurance investigator assigned to his case was suspicious. The fire had burned too completely. The timing, during the blackout chaos, was convenient. And when the investigator dug deeper, he found evidence that Katz had relocated tenants in the days before the blackout. The case went from routine claim to arson investigation. Katz hired a lawyer, prepared to fight the case in court. But the guilt was eating him alive. He couldn't sleep, couldn't look at himself in the mirror. The insurance money, which was supposed to save him from bankruptcy, felt poisoned. 3 months after the blackout, he confessed, told his lawyer everything, asked what he should do. The lawyer advised him to say nothing, that they couldn't prove arson without his confession. But Katz went to the police anyway, turned himself in, pled guilty to insurance fraud and arson, got 3 years in prison, of which he served 18 months. Other building owners who'd done the same thing never confessed, never got caught, collected their insurance money and moved on. The difference between Katz and them wasn't the crime. It was the capacity to live with it. Some people could compartmentalize, justify, forget. Katz couldn't. The moral weight was too heavy. Prison was almost a relief, a concrete punishment for concrete guilt, better than the psychological torment of pretending he hadn't done anything wrong. The trials began in the fall and stretched into 1978. The courtrooms were packed with defendants, their families, victims seeking restitution. The proceedings varied wildly in quality. Some defendants got competent representation. Others got public defenders handling 50 cases simultaneously who could barely remember their clients' names. The outcomes were correspondingly unequal. People with resources hired lawyers who got charges reduced or dismissed. People without resources took plea deals that gave them criminal records for minor offenses. The racial disparities were impossible to ignore. The vast majority of those arrested, over 90%, were Black or Latino. Not because white people didn't participate in the looting, but because the looting happened primarily in poor neighborhoods that were heavily policed after the blackout, while wealthier neighborhoods experienced minimal police response. The system punished geography as much as behavior. Where you lived determined whether you got arrested. Whether you got arrested determined whether you got a criminal record. Whether you got a criminal record determined your future job prospects, housing options, life trajectory. Judge Martha Harrison presided over several hundred blackout cases and grew increasingly troubled by what she was seeing. Young people whose lives were being permanently marked for stealing items worth less than $100. Parents with no criminal history facing years in prison for taking food during a crisis. The law said these were crimes. Her conscience said the system was failing to deliver justice. She started using her discretion more aggressively, dismissing weak cases, reducing charges, giving probation instead of jail time when she could justify it. The DA's office complained, the police union complained, the mayor's office called her judgment into question. But Harrison had lifetime tenure and a thick skin. She kept making decisions based on individual circumstances rather than blanket policies. Years later, she'd be remembered as one of the few voices of moderation during the blackout prosecutions. But at the time, she was criticized for being soft on crime, for not understanding the message that needed to be sent. The message that was sent, through thousands of arrests, hundreds of convictions, millions in bail and fines, was that the poor would pay for the blackout, not the landlords who'd abandoned buildings, not the employers who'd moved jobs to the suburbs, not the politicians who'd cut city services. The people who'd looted stores during a crisis would carry the legal consequences, while the structural conditions that created the crisis remained unaddressed. Some of the store owners never recovered financially. Rodriguez kept his bodega open, but his revenue never returned to pre-blackout levels. Customers who'd shopped there for years now went elsewhere. Shame at participating in the looting, resentment at being excluded, the awkward weight of unspoken history. He limped along for another decade before finally selling to a chain that turned it into something generic and soulless. The personal relationship between shopkeeper and community that had been broken during the blackout and never fully repaired. The insurance settlements, when they finally came, were often inadequate. Companies paid pennies on the dollar, citing depreciation and policy limitations. Store owners who'd lost everything received checks that covered maybe a third of their actual losses. Some took the money and relocated, abandoning the neighborhood to empty storefronts and for rent signs that stayed up for years. The economic recovery everyone talked about never reached these areas. The blackout had accelerated a process of disinvestment that was already happening, and there was no political will to reverse it. The emotional and psychological aftermath was harder to document but equally real. PTSD wasn't a common diagnosis in 1977, especially not for civilians. But people experienced the symptoms: flashbacks to the fires, anxiety during storms or power outages, hypervigilance about security, distrust of neighbors. The blackout had traumatized entire communities. But there were no support services, no counseling programs, no acknowledgement that what people had experienced might have lasting psychological effects. Maria Gonzalez and her children, who'd lost their apartment to fire, struggled to adjust to their new circumstances. The temporary shelter gave way to a smaller apartment in a worse neighborhood. The kids changed schools, lost friends, dealt with the stigma of being, quote, blackout refugees. Gonzalez worked 2 jobs to make rent, was never home, watched her children raise themselves, and knew she was failing them but didn't know what else to do. The blackout had been one night. The consequences were ongoing, compounding, multiplying year after year. Her youngest daughter, who'd asked about Mr. Buttons the stuffed bear, developed anxiety about fire, would wake up screaming from nightmares, would refuse to go into buildings without checking for exits. At 8 years old, she'd learned that safety was conditional, that everything could be taken away in minutes, that the world was more dangerous than adults wanted to admit. No amount of reassurance could erase what she'd experienced. The trauma was written into her nervous system, a permanent alteration of how she processed the world. The city eventually commissioned an official report on the blackout, analyzing what went wrong with the power grid and how to prevent future cascades. The technical recommendations were implemented: better protective systems, backup redundancy, improved coordination between utilities. The electrical infrastructure got stronger, but there was no equivalent report on the social infrastructure that had failed. No analysis of why communities tore themselves apart. No recommendations for addressing the economic conditions that had created desperation. The mechanical problems got fixed. The human problems were ignored. Political careers rose and fell based on the blackout. Mayor Beam lost his re-election bid, punished by voters who blamed him for the chaos. Ed Koch won by promising to restore order, to make the city safer, to crack down on crime. His administration would transform New York over the next decade, but the transformation would favor Manhattan over the outer boroughs, business districts over residential neighborhoods, development over social services. The communities damaged by the blackout would be left to recover on their own. Some individuals found redemption in the aftermath. Marcus, the teenager who'd thrown the first brick, eventually got his case dismissed on a technicality. He used the second chance to finish high school, go to community college, get a job in social services helping at-risk youth. He'd spend decades working with teenagers, trying to provide the support and opportunity he'd lacked, trying to prevent them from making the choices he'd made. The stolen radio sat in a drawer in his childhood bedroom, a reminder of who he'd been and who he'd decided not to be. Angela Martinez, who'd taken groceries during the looting, became a community activist, organizing tenant rights groups and food distribution programs. She never forgot the desperation that had driven her into that store, but she also never forgot the shame of participating in the neighborhood's destruction. Her activism was partly atonement, trying to build the kind of community support that would make looting unnecessary, trying to create the infrastructure of care that the city wouldn't provide. The cultural legacy of the blackout would be complex and contested. Hip-hop, born partly from equipment stolen during the looting, would become a global phenomenon. The music captured the anger, the desperation, the creativity of communities that had been abandoned. It gave voice to people who'd been silenced, but it also commodified that struggle, turned pain into profit, sometimes in ways that felt exploitative. The blackout became mythology, referenced in songs and stories, but the real people who'd suffered were often erased from the narrative. Thanks for staying with this complex journey through one night that changed New York forever. These hidden chapters of urban history deserve to be remembered. I'll see you in the next one. 40 years later, scholars would still debate what the blackout meant. Was it a spontaneous eruption of rage against systemic injustice, or a breakdown of social order that revealed the worst of human nature? The answer was probably both. The blackout had been a moment of moral complexity, where justified anger at abandonment met unjustified destruction of community, where systemic failure created individual crisis, where the darkness revealed both the best and worst of what people were capable of. The legal aftermath eventually faded, cases were resolved, sentences were served. Criminal records became permanent markers that would affect people's lives decades later when applying for jobs, apartments, loans. The justice system had processed the blackout through its machinery and produced outcomes that satisfied no one. Not the victims who'd lost businesses and homes, not the defendants who felt unjustly targeted, not the community members who understood that punishment without addressing root causes was just theater. And the neighborhoods that had burned? Some recovered. Gentrification would eventually bring investment to places like Bushwick, though often displacing the people who'd lived through the blackout. Other areas, like parts of the South Bronx, would take decades to stabilize. The empty lots where buildings had burned would stay empty for years, then become community gardens or affordable housing or, in some cases, just stay empty. Permanent scars on the landscape, reminders of that night when the lights went out and the city consumed itself. The blackout had been a test of infrastructure, of community, of the social fabric that holds cities together. New York had failed in some ways, succeeded in others. The electrical grid got fixed. The communities didn't. And that choice, to invest in mechanical systems while neglecting human systems, would define the city's trajectory for decades. The lights came back on, but some darkness remained. On July 13, 2019, the 42nd anniversary of the blackout, a journalist from NPR interviewed former participants about that night. She found people across the spectrum of experience: looters, police officers, store owners, firefighters, all willing to talk now that decades had passed and the immediate anger had cooled into something more like collective memory. What emerged from those conversations was a picture of the blackout as a watershed moment, a night that changed the city and the people who lived through it in ways both visible and invisible. One of the people she interviewed was a man in his late 50s, a grandfather now, respectable and soft-spoken. He showed her a lamp he'd taken from a furniture store on Fulton Street during the blackout. He'd kept it all those years, he said, as a reminder of the person he'd been and the person he'd decided not to be. The lamp still worked. He'd never used it. It sat in his basement, wrapped in a sheet, a physical artifact of a night he couldn't forget and didn't want to. The journalist asked why he'd kept it. Why not get rid of it? Erase the evidence. Move on. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. Said that forgetting was too easy. Said that he needed to remember what he was capable of when the structures holding society together disappeared. Said the lamp was a lesson in humility, in understanding that morality is partly circumstantial, that the darkness revealed parts of himself he hadn't known existed. 42 years later, he was still processing what it meant. The blackout of 2003 provided an interesting comparison point. On August 14, 2003, a cascading failure similar to 1977's knocked out power across the Northeast, affecting 50 million people, including 8 million in New York City. The blackout lasted up to 2 days in some areas, but the response was completely different. No widespread looting, no fires. Instead, New Yorkers helped each other, directed traffic, checked on neighbors, shared resources. The contrast with 1977 was stark and invited questions about what had changed in the intervening years. Part of the answer was economic. By 2003, New York had undergone a massive transformation. The fiscal crisis had been resolved. Crime had plummeted. Neighborhoods that had burned in 1977 had gentrified. The city that had been on the verge of bankruptcy was now a global financial capital, attracting wealth and investment. The desperate poverty that had characterized places like the South Bronx in the 70s had been replaced. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough to change the social dynamics. But the economic explanation wasn't complete. The 2003 blackout also occurred in a different cultural moment. The September 11th attacks had happened less than 2 years earlier. New York had experienced collective trauma and had responded with collective resilience. The city had a fresh memory of pulling together during crisis. The social cohesion that had been absent in 1977 was present in 2003, and it made all the difference in how people responded to darkness. The 1977 blackout had revealed a city divided against itself, where different neighborhoods might as well have been different countries. The 2003 blackout revealed a city that had learned, at terrible cost, the importance of community response to crisis. The lessons hadn't come easy. They'd been written in the ruins of burned buildings, in the trauma of communities torn apart, in the long, slow work of rebuilding trust. But they'd been learned. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 provided another test. The superstorm knocked out power to large parts of New York for days. This time, the response was more mixed, mostly community resilience, but also some looting, some conflict, some breakdown of order. The pattern suggested that social cohesion is fragile, dependent on circumstances, never guaranteed. The lessons of 1977 weren't permanent. They had to be relearned, reinforced, maintained through active effort. The physical landscape of New York still bears traces of the 1977 blackout, though you have to know where to look. In Bushwick, there are buildings that date from the late 70s and early 80s, built to replace structures that burned. The architecture is different, cheaper, more utilitarian, marking a clear break from the pre-blackout neighborhood. Urban archaeologists can read the history in the buildings, see where the fires burned, and where communities managed to protect themselves. The empty lots are mostly gone now, filled in by decades of development. But older residents remember what used to stand there: the pharmacy that never reopened, the grocery store that burned, the apartment building where Maria Gonzalez raised her children before the fire. These absences are part of the neighborhood's memory, invisible to newcomers but deeply felt by anyone who lived through that night. The cultural legacy is more visible. Hip-hop, born partly from equipment stolen during the blackout, became one of the city's most significant exports. The music carries traces of that night. The anger, the creativity born from limitation, the voice of communities that had been marginalized. When Grandmaster Flash talks about his origins, he mentions the blackout. Not proudly, but honestly. It's part of the story, part of how he became who he is. The New York that emerged from the blackout was harder, more cynical, less trusting than the city that had gone into it. The romantic notion of the city that never sleeps, the place where community bonds were stronger than anywhere, had been shattered. What replaced it was a more realistic understanding of urban life, that cities are contested spaces, where different communities have different experiences, where inequality creates fractures that can erupt into crisis. The policy changes were mixed. The electrical grid got more reliable. Emergency response systems were improved. But the social policies that might have prevented the conditions that created the chaos, investment in poor neighborhoods, job creation, addressing structural racism, those were mostly ignored. The city chose to focus on symptoms rather than causes, on punishment rather than prevention. Some problems were solved. Others were just managed, contained, pushed into the background, where they continued to fester. For the individuals who lived through it, the blackout became a defining moment. The nurse who worked with a broken wrist, the doctor who operated by flashlight, the firefighter who made impossible choices about who to save. These people carried the experience with them, let it shape their understanding of what they were capable of, what duty meant, what sacrifice looked like in practice. Some became mentors, teaching the next generation about crisis response. Others left their professions, burned out by the intensity of that night. The former looters carried different lessons. Some, like Marcus, used the experience as a turning point, a moment of recognizing they could choose differently. Others rationalized it, justified it, refused to examine their choices too closely because the moral complexity was too uncomfortable. The psychological legacy varied based on individual temperament and circumstance, but everyone who participated in the looting carried some version of that night with them, even if they never talked about it. The victims, store owners, residents who'd lost homes, people who'd been injured, had their own processing to do. Some found forgiveness. Others nursed resentment for decades. Rodriguez, the bodega owner, eventually made peace with what happened, understanding it as a symptom of larger problems rather than personal betrayal. But it took years, and some of his fellow store owners never got there, carried their anger to the grave. The children who lived through the blackout, like Maria Gonzalez's daughter, grew up with a specific understanding of how fragile civilization is. They'd seen order break down, seen adults behave in ways that defied everything they'd been taught about right and wrong, seen fire consume their homes. These weren't abstract lessons from history books. These were lived experiences that shaped their worldview. Many became community activists, social workers, people dedicated to building the kind of society that wouldn't fracture in a crisis. The question historians still debate is whether the blackout was inevitable. If the lightning had struck in a different location, if the protective systems had worked as designed, if the cascade had been prevented, would New York have avoided the crisis? Or were the underlying tensions so severe that some triggering event would have eventually sparked the explosion? The evidence suggests the latter. The blackout was a catalyst, not a cause. The fuel had been accumulating for years. Something would have ignited it eventually. Understanding this is important for contemporary urban planning. Cities are complex systems where economic, social, and infrastructure factors interact in unpredictable ways. Neglecting any one system, letting inequality grow unchecked, allowing infrastructure to deteriorate, abandoning communities to disinvestment, creates vulnerabilities that can cascade into crisis. The 1977 blackout was a lesson in systems thinking, in understanding that everything connects to everything else. New York today is unrecognizable from the city of 1977 in many ways. Wealthier, safer, more expensive, more unequal. The neighborhoods that burned have gentrified, though often at the cost of displacing the people who survived the blackout. The city has learned to manage crises better, to coordinate emergency response, to maintain infrastructure. But some of the underlying issues that contributed to the blackout, inequality, racial division, concentrated poverty, remain, just in different forms. The final memo from that night, the one documenting the cascade failure, the emergency response, the damage, was classified for years. When it was finally released, it revealed something that many had suspected, but few had been able to prove. The protective systems that failed during the blackout had been flagged as problematic in engineering reports months earlier. Budget constraints had delayed the fixes. The blackout wasn't just bad luck. It was a predictable consequence of deferred maintenance, of choosing short-term savings over long-term safety. That pattern, deferring maintenance, ignoring warnings, prioritizing budget over safety, continues in cities across America. Bridges deteriorate, water systems fail, power grids strain under demand. The lessons of 1977 haven't been fully learned because the political incentives haven't changed. It's easier to cut budgets than to invest in prevention, easier to respond to crises than to prevent them. Until the next blackout, the next infrastructure failure, the next preventable disaster. And so the final memo was filed away, classified for 75 years, waiting for a generation that might finally understand what really happened that winter. Waiting for people who could look at the blackout not as ancient history, but as a warning still relevant, still urgent, still unheeded. Waiting for a society willing to invest in preventing the next crisis, rather than just punishing the people who respond to it in desperate ways. The lights came back on July 14, 1977, but for some, the darkness never fully lifted. The trauma, the lessons, the changes, they became part of New York's DNA, woven into the city's understanding of itself. The blackout was 25 hours of darkness, but what it illuminated about inequality, abandonment, and social fracture remains visible decades later for anyone willing to look. The city that emerged from those ruins was different. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. Forever marked by the night, the lights went out and the city consumed itself. The stories continue, the survivors age. The memories fade but never disappear completely. And somewhere in Brooklyn, a man in his late 50s keeps a lamp in his basement, wrapped in a sheet, a reminder of who he was and who he chose not to be. The lamp still works. He still never uses it. And every July 13th, he thinks about that night, about the darkness, about the choices people make when the structures holding society together disappear. And he wonders if we've learned enough to prevent it from happening again. The answer, after all these years, is still uncertain.